recording. We're not live yet. Oh, now we're being live streamed. So now we're officially on YouTube. How are you, Mr. Paynter?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm happy it's Tuesday. It just means tomorrow's Wednesday, and then 2 days later is Friday. So slowly working through the work
Yay.
week.
That's right. And do you have kids, Joe?
No kids, no kids.
No kids. Okay. We're barreling quickly towards March break too, so my kids are very excited they're getting a week off in a couple of weeks.
For sure. And what does that mean for you? Are you excited for the week off or?
No,
I
I
feel like
don't get
some
a
parents
week
are
off. The kids
50-50.
get a week
No.
off, but not me. No. My kids are all teenagers, so they just hang out and do their own thing and have sleepovers with
Yeah,
friends and do that kind of stuff, and I'm just at work all day.
that's all right. I mean, it's good for the kids. Like I like how school has so many breaks. I think it's really important. And March break
Yeah.
is a good time to hang out with friends. That's what I did, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we're just starting to see the very early beginnings of spring. The little bit of warmer weather, starting to see the snow shrink a bit, and
I looked
I look
outside
forward to
just
having a
now.
driveway where I don't have to watch out for the snowbanks every time I pull in.
For sure. It's funny you actually say that. I just looked outside. My blinds are open. I'm like, wow, it's 5 o'clock and it's still light out. It's
I
amazing
know.
to see. That clicked in for me just now, and I'm like, wow. It's nice not starting work in the dark and ending in the dark and having some light. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Um, so it is officially 5 o'clock. It is officially after hours. Everyone watching either on Zoom or via YouTube, welcome, welcome, welcome to Family Law Now After Hours. Today's topic is adultery, affairs, and spying. Please note always the purpose of this series is to discuss general information on separation, divorce, and other family law matters, and any information provided here should not be construed as legal advice. If you are watching us via Zoom today, we highly encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit any questions or comments you have. Unfortunately, if you are on YouTube, you won't actually be able to use this Q&A feature. But if you are on Zoom, this is something that we definitely recommend using, and we definitely welcome it. As always, if you have any questions regarding your specific matter, please either call our office or a lawyer in your area to book a consultation to be able to actually receive specific tailored advice as it relates to your matter. And stay tuned until the end as we will be sharing how you can schedule a free initial consultation with one of our lawyers here at Russell Alexander. So to start, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Mr. Jonathan Paynter. He is my co-host for today's webinar. Jonathan is a registered social worker and psychotherapist who works in the family law system, completing parenting plan assessments, voice of the child reports, family mediation, and collaborative family law in private practice. He also provides psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and couples counseling for children and adults. Jonathan is also on the board of directors of the Ontario Association for Family Mediation, and he holds the executive position as treasurer of the board, and he is also on the board of the Collaborative Practice of Durham Region. Myself, I am a family lawyer here at the firm, driven by a deep desire to support families going through challenging times. With a background in commerce, I bring strong negotiation, analytical, and critical thinking skills to my practice. And during my articling period, I gained confidence in handling a wide range of family law matters. I emphasize active listening, clear communication, and empathy, fostering a comfortable environment for my clients. I am certified as a collaborative lawyer with the Ontario Association of Collaborative Professionals, and thus I offer clients an alternative dispute resolution approach to avoid court. Outside of work, I am a dedicated Toronto Maple Leafs fan. By the way, they're playing great as of late, as well as an LA Rams fan. I enjoy playing hockey and watching comedy movies. I say that now that they're playing great because when April comes and it's playoffs, it's a little disappointing, but
Things might
listen,
change.
we'll focus on the regular season for now. Um, and with that introduction, let's go in and let's get started. So we have a lot
Yeah.
of great subtopics today. The first being defining actually what is adultery and affairs. So with that, let's get right into it. So Adultery itself is a legal definition that's under the Divorce Act in Ontario. And the Divorce Act is a federal piece of legislation. So it not only applies to married couples in Ontario, but it applies to all married couples in the country. And specifically for cases of divorce, adultery means sexual relations between a married person and someone who is not their spouse. So the court does not require evidence of love or an emotional connection. Rather, sexual intercourse with a third party is the key factor for adultery. As it relates to the idea of emotional affairs, so whether that be a close emotional connection or flirting, both of those are generally not classified as adultery in legal terms when it relates to the legislation itself. But as Jonathan's going to touch on later in this webinar, they can have a serious emotional and psychological impact on the parties involved, as well as if there's children involved. And affairs can include not just the physical adultery itself, but also online relationships. And it really is dependent on the nature of the involvement. I mean, the legal definition of adultery applies solely to marriages, and it does not actually extend to common law relationships. So there's a really big difference in terms of how adultery is applied. Adultery, and I'm going to get into the legal implications soon, but there is extension of the idea of adultery and how it relates to a married couple versus how it extends, or in this case, how it does not extend to common law relationships under Ontario law, under the Family Law Act. And the legal consequences of adultery are really more significant when it comes to the emotional impact. They don't influence financial matters such as property division or spousal support in Ontario, unless there's always the unless, so there's always the but in the legal practice. But it does have an influence on the financial matters if the adultery itself has a direct impact on children or spousal safety. So with that brief introduction on defining adultery and affairs and how that corresponds into the legal nature, Jonathan, would you be able to touch on the emotional impact as it relates to Sam?
Yeah, and I want to go a little bit deeper into defining the adultery and affairs and kind of looking at sort of the different types of affairs, that kind of thing,
Please,
just to add
for
on to
sure.
the legal definition. And I find it very interesting, and maybe you can answer this question, Joe. I don't think the Divorce Act actually defines what adultery is, does it? Or is it just defined in case law?
So it is defined in case law. I believe the actual definition of adultery itself is defined as a sexual relation between a married person and someone who is
Okay.
not their spouse. But I believe that it's definitely a definition that is expanded through case law.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of different kinds of affairs. There's sexual affairs are the ones that most people think of when they think of an affair. It could be an emotional affair where you have kind of an emotional bond, an emotional connection to someone outside of the marriage that you're getting a lot of your emotional needs met through instead of your spouse. Um, there can also be, paid affairs. Like there are websites like Ashley Madison that are pretty much entirely dedicated to affairs, or there's other other companies like SugarDaddy.com that connects married men with single women. Some affairs involve, having sex with escorts, or going to an erotic massage place, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different options. There's also, interestingly, one phenomenon that's becoming more and more common in Canada over the last few years is polyamory, where you have more than one partner that you have relations with, and there can even be affairs within that, because there might be some rules in the relationship saying that you can have a relationship with someone else, but you have to come and tell me about it first, or it can't be emotional relationship, whatever the rules are. If they breach the rules, it could be um, considered an affair, even if it's a polyamorous relationship. Um, and affairs are pretty common. They happen in about 20 to 40% of marriages experience one affair or more. And they're one of the biggest factors that lead to separation and divorce in Canada. I think they account for between 20 and 40% of separations, depending on the study that you're looking at. And the stats are probably even higher for common law relationships. Um, those are for straight couples. For same-sex couples, about 14% of gay relationships report infidelity, and about 6% of lesbian relationships. So it's pretty common, and it can have a really major impact on the relationship. Now, let's like backtrack a little bit and recognize that affairs are usually a sign of either one of the members of the relationship had some emotional issues that they're not addressing, and it is contributing to the affair. So it could be, someone who has ADHD and they're really impulsive and they end up, having sex at a conference for work, or it could be someone who's a narcissist who only cares about themselves. So there could be individual factors that lead to it, and then there could be much more common are relationship factors. It's an unhealthy relationship. The parties aren't aligned on various issues, including sex. They're not getting along, they're not connecting, they're not supporting each other, and one person steps outside of the marriage to get some of the needs met that aren't being met in the marriage. That's the far more common scenario than sort of one individual causing all the affairs, although that does happen sometimes. What tends to happen, though, is when the affair is discovered, the person who is, let's say that we'll call them the victim of the affair, not the perpetrator of the affair, they usually get very upset and angry, feel betrayed. They feel that there's been a breach of their trust. It can be very humiliating, especially if it happens within a small community. So if you live in a small town, or if you're part of a profession and everybody knows your business, family lawyers, for example, are a pretty insular profession. Everybody kind of knows each other in the area. They can have a really uh, big effect on not just the individual, not just the family system, but also at the community level as well. Um, and some of the effects of an affair can look a lot like really severe mental health conditions like PTSD. You can literally become traumatized by finding out about an affair. It doesn't happen in everybody, but I would say it's pretty much universal that it's an awful experience to discover that your partner has been unfaithful to you. Now, there are some circumstances where that's not the case, and maybe the person's really looking forward to the end of the relationship. And this gives them an out, but those are pretty rare. I think most situations it causes a pretty bad emotional impact and can lead to, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and just make life overall very unpleasant for the person who the affair was against. And then the person who had the affair might also experience a lot of shame and guilt and anxiety about it. They may be may have been very unhappy in the marriage for many years, and then that led to them stepping outside of the marriage. So they can become very confused. Like, do I stay in my marriage? Do I stay with this new person? So that, it can have a really wide range of effects on people, um, and it really on the relationship level, it completely breaks trust, and that's something that's pretty difficult to rebuild. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it takes a long time to rebuild that trust. And there is a process that couples can take to rebuild that trust slowly and gradually over time. it often causes a complete breakdown of the communication in the couple relationship, right? Like they, often won't speak or get into lots of big fights every time they do speak. So it can really ramp up conflict between the couple. And the person who is the victim of the affair might enter into a state of emotional detachment after finding about the affair to kind of protect themselves from the harsh reality that their partner's been that unfaithful to them and breached their trust so significantly. So that it makes it really hard to rebuild that emotional connection between the couple. So those are the kind of impacts on the relationship side. In terms of the wider community, I mean, it can affect obviously children. I'll talk about that in a bit. It can affect extended family members. Parents, siblings often get on board in when these sorts of things are discovered. Sometimes they can be really supportive and helpful and, encourage the couple to go to therapy and get help and be there for support. And sometimes it can make things worse. They can be that Greek chorus in the person's ear saying, you got to divorce this person who did that and maybe say some nasty things about them. Stirring up more conflict, more unhappy feelings, kind of amplifying all the negativity. And then, it can affect a lot of things. It can affect someone's job. There have been lots of situations where an affair of someone with a public job has become known to the public and, they don't work there anymore. So it can have a lot of cascading effects, uh, in multiple layers in a person's life. So it can be really tricky to get through this kind of thing.
100%. And
What
I
what, what
mean,
do you think? What do you think are the kind of legal implications of affairs in family law?
there's a ton, um, more so directed and as in the divorce itself and how that process actually unfolds. And I do want to correct myself. Um,
Yeah.
and from what I said previously, you are correct that the Divorce Act does not explicitly define adultery, and that it is through the process of case law historically how we've actually come to the term. So I did want to make a correction on that, and I appreciate you actually prompting me to revisit that. So I appreciate that. But
No problem.
in terms of the legal implications with respects to adultery. Under the Divorce Act, which again, as I mentioned, is federal legislation, divorce in marriage is a federal responsibility. So they create the laws and rules that individuals have to follow with respects to processes on that front. But adultery is actually a ground for divorce. Um, because there's three grounds to divorces. There's adultery, family violence, and just regular separation for greater than 1 year. So adultery is a ground for divorce. It's one of the three. However, with respects to adultery, proof is necessary if you're gonna put
Mm,
forward a claim as it relates to a divorce through that route. This could include either direct testimony, third-party witness testimony, or other forms of admissible evidence, for example, photos or phone records. I mean, as the law of Canada stands, and even specifically if we're looking at Ontario through how the superior courts in Ontario have, enforce this federal legislation. Ontario and the rest of Canada, the rest of country, allows for what's called a no-fault divorce process. And under the grounds of separation for 1 year, that's the commonality, that's the common route that most couples take. Um, which means that even if one spouse actually does commit adultery, the divorce can still be granted without proving fault. With that said, even if adultery has occurred in the relationship, given the high evidentiary burden, again, the needs of having to get this direct testimony, the third party witnesses, any other admissible evidence that you want to put forward, um, the cost associated with gathering that information and the cost associated presenting it to the court, as well as the time it takes to actually get in front of a judge, especially if it's something that's contested, which more often than not, it usually is something that's contested. Uh, Parties are actually best off just proceeding by way of the standard tract, which is the standard separation for 1 year. Um, because by the time you get in front of a judge, the 1 year since you've separated likely
Yeah.
or more than likely would have passed. So, and you would have had to have paid an additional cost of having your lawyer prepare the materials, proving the evidence. So, I mean, more often than not, it is a way to get an expedited divorce. But if the divorce is contested in the sense that for whatever reason the other party doesn't want to agree that adultery took place, which is within their right, they're allowed to do so. The general course, the standard tract of divorce by way of separation for 1 year is common. Um, with respects to the
Yeah,
division
I
of
guess that would
property
only
itself,
come up in cases where somebody
sorry, go
wants
ahead.
to get it would only sort of come up in cases where someone wants to get remarried like immediately, really, because
A
otherwise,
hundred percent.
anybody can divorce for any reason. They just got to wait a year. And so, why bother going all through all this rigmarole and expense of proving that the other person had an affair when you can just say, well, we're done.
100%. And I mean, the same thing also applies with respects to family violence. I mean,
Yep.
unfortunately, the evidentiary, I know we're not discussing about that ground of divorce today, but I figured I would just speak to it because we're speaking about grounds of divorce. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
the evidentiary burden is just as high with respects to proving family violence and getting that divorce immediately. So even if there is family violence in the relationship, more often than not, parties still proceed by way of separation by 1 year before
Yeah.
actually moving forward with the affidavit uh, for divorce.
Yeah. Because it'll take
With
like a
respect,
couple of years just to prove the family violence happened, right?
exactly, and I mean, just because the separation, it requires that the parties live separate and apart. So that's not to say that two individuals and maybe there's a victim of family violence, that's not to say that they have to remain living with that person, right?
Hmm.
If they're not in a safe environment, they should be seeking assistance either by way of contacting the police or if it's a woman, then a woman's shelter. So that just because the wording I don't want people to think that because there's family violence that they need to remain in a relationship because of risk
No.
of legal implications. I want to make sure that people are safe and they know that if there is family violence occurring, um,
Get
the
out as soon as
exactly,
possible.
exactly, and it won't have an effect on your legal process moving forward. You're still entitled
No.
to the same division of property if you're married. The same child support laws and regulations apply. Spousal support, all of these things still apply. So if you're in a dangerous situation and you're experiencing family violence, you shouldn't be still remaining in the same household. I know Jonathan can attest to that 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, well said, Joe.
And so with respects to adultery and the division of property, and again, the division of property, um, there's legislation as it relates to married spouses. Unfortunately, the same property rights are not transferable to common law. So with respects to the division of property, the equal division of property in family law is not influenced by adultery, and the property each party accumulated during the marriage is generally divided equally unless there is a prenup or postnup agreement, or again, if the parties are common law, in which the property division regime doesn't apply to common law spouses. With respects to spousal support, um, the law looks at the financial need and ability to pay when determining spousal support, and it's not related to marital fault. So even if a spouse was unfaithful, committed adultery, it doesn't automatically impact spousal support calculations. As it relates to parenting, in cases where one spouse has actually committed adultery, this again will not automatically impact child parenting decisions, as any decisions relating to parenting or relocation are determined based on the best interest of the child. However, I always like to add the whoever's. If the affair or the adultery does lead to behavior that negatively affects the child's well-being, such as exposure to dangerous or inappropriate conduct, then at that point, the adultery or the affair could be considered when determining parenting arrangements, for example, such as decision-making responsibility or parenting time. Aside from the legal implications, there's also the emotional impact on the children. I know that Jonathan is going to touch on that soon, but while adultery may not directly impact the legal decisions, there is the emotional impact on the children, and that may influence parenting arrangements, whether that be decision-making responsibility or parenting time. And courts prioritize children's emotional and physical well-being. That's their number one priority. So if one spouse's behavior does harm the child or exposes them to unhealthy relationships, this is something that can affect decisions as it relates to decision-making responsibility and parenting time.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of, yeah, decision making, like I haven't seen it impact, that issue very often, but there are a few
Mhm.
rare situations where, for example, the affair happened during one parent's time and they were kind of neglecting the children to participate in the affair,
Mhm.
or the children were exposed to the parent having sex with their with the other person. Those would be the kinds of rare situations where it would impact
It's
parenting.
very
I
extenuating
find,
circumstances.
but it's pretty
Very,
rare.
very
And
extenuating
I find
circumstances, for sure.
a lot of parents, and I don't know if this has been your experience, Joe, as well, but a lot of parents where an affair has happened expect it to have a major impact on all these decisions like spousal support and custody of the child, or the decision making about the children and the parenting schedule, all that kind of stuff. But it really doesn't in family
It,
law. Like, it's pretty rare. It would have to be a fairly extreme case for that to really impact those those negotiations. Is that your
a
experience
hundred
too?
percent. I mean, for sure. Bottom line is the only real legal implication adultery has is again is if one party wants to expedite a divorce. Otherwise, it has no relation to the financial aspects of a separation and ensuing divorce. And as you said, unless there's those rare extenuating circumstances where ultimately the child's well-being and safety is at risk, that's really the only way in which adultery comes into play. So I mean, it's more so the emotional impact, not so
Yes.
much the legal impact.
Yes. And
And that,
um,
sorry, go
I'll
ahead.
get into that a bit more, but yeah, that can be a major factor because these things often cause a lot of conflict, and conflict is very important to the negotiations about parenting time and decision making and those kinds of things.
100%. I mean, this was something I sort of wanted to ask you when we were talking about the emotional impact, but I'll wait till we talk about, the impact on the children and how that sort of ties in with family mediation.
Yeah.
Um, but now what I'm going to do, I'm going to sort of shift directions here. I'm actually going to talk about, and these are questions I get from clients all the time. Can I do this? I want to prove this. So I
Mhm.
want to really look at and discuss the privacy and the surveillance do's and don'ts.
Mm,
I really like the
great.
coining of that term, the do's and don'ts. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, with respects to spying or surveillance, if a spouse does engage in that practice of the other spouse, and I've seen instances where one party has installed, a tracking software on their
Yep.
phone. I've seen ones where they put a GPS tracker on in a vehicle.
Yep.
More common, I've
AirTags
seen
on
hacking.
handbags or phones or
Yep.
something. Yep.
Exactly, exactly. I've seen hacking into personal accounts.
Yep.
Um, I've seen going into people's Facebook pages or logging into their Instagram accounts. Um, all of these things can result in legal consequences. And that could also include charges under the criminal code. So
Hmm.
a lot of these tasks that people engage in, it could be seen as harassment, it can be seen as stalking. So you have to be extremely careful in what you engage yourself in. And I mean, all of the things I've mentioned, the tracking software, the GPSs, the air tags, the hacking into social media accounts, these can definitely if the other spouse does find out and the police are notified, this can definitely include charges for those things. So I would avoid all of those things at all costs. Um, as well as the fact is that our province, we have very strict privacy laws. And actions even amounting to reading a private message or recording private conversations without that person's consent could be considered of a violation of one's privacy. So you have to be extremely careful about the steps you take. There are instances which I like to classify as legal surveillance. So I mean, people sometimes engage in the use of um, hiring private investigators. I mean, in that sense, enough those are legal methods of surveillance, as well as any type of surveillance that is carried out openly and with consent or with a court order. I mean, oftentimes judges do allow for certain orders or forms of relief by way of requests of information. And if you put forward enough evidence to the court, uh, and the judge can actually grant you permission to do certain types of surveillance. Um,
Hmm.
whether you
Interesting.
have you can have access to someone's bank accounts. There's certain ways in which if you meet the evidentiary threshold and you can convince a judge that your requests are admissible and they're relevant and they're valid and they advance a legal perspective or a legal position, a court will grant that. I mean, it's more so in cases of abuse. But or with respects to finances, but I mean I have seen it where courts have allowed it through an order. But I mean, it all comes back to the fact that any evidence one person obtains, either through, as I mentioned, the illegal surveillance or the illegal spying methods, right? So hacking into a private email, hacking into a social media account, the tracking software. All of these things are typically inadmissible in a court. So even if you go through this process and you get all of this incriminating evidence, a judge is not necessarily going to take that evidence. A lot of the times, if the evidence is obtained through an illegal means, it would be deemed as inadmissible by the court, right? So
Well,
a judge,
even not even illegal, like even if it's in bad taste, the judge will sometimes or often reject it because they don't want to encourage this behavior in future families because they know that, doing surveillance on your ex usually leads to more conflict. Like nobody's happy when they find out, oh yeah, my ex has been recording me secretly. And so I've seen people spend lots of money on, private investigators and cameras and blah blah blah, and they have the evidence and they think, wow, like this is really going to be great to prove my court case, only to have it thrown out by the judge, and the judge won't even consider it. So yeah,
100%.
I you have to talk to a lawyer before you make those decisions. Don't just impulsively go out and go to the spy shop and buy a bunch of infrared cameras or whatever, because you might be wasting your money. Probably you are.
Probably you are. I mean, we've discussed this topic of the ideal of surveillance so much on the show. I mean, often, and I know it doesn't necessarily relate to adultery, but we're speaking to it, and I think it's an important topic.
Yeah,
Sometimes one parent will film the exchange when there's parenting times exchange. They'll film the
yeah.
exchange, or they'll film arguments between spouses in front of the children to make a point, saying, "Oh, I didn't start this. Look what happens." And I mean, all even as you said, a judge definitely looks they frown upon this type of evidence, any videoing of arguments or any surveillance of that nature, especially as it relates to the children.
And it can
Going
backfire
back,
too, right? Because if
oh yeah,
you spend a lot of time doing surveillance on your spouse and then bring it to court, the judge is now going to have a negative view of you, not your spouse. So it can really hinder your success in court if you're going to go and do that, make that decision without consulting your lawyer and following your lawyer's advice.
100%, 100%. And just, going back to the fact that, going back to the admissibility of it itself and what a judge may think, right? Whether a judge even rules that it was, obtained unethically or unlawfully, and as you said, they'll just outright refute it based on the premise that it doesn't work towards finding a resolution and coming to,
Mhm.
an end to and coming to a settlement. It could also, like I said, one could face criminal charges as a result. So don't engage in any surveillance until you speak to a family lawyer. Um, there are times in which there's consensual surveillance. I mean, sometimes,
Mhm.
both parties will agree to certain forms of monitoring. Um, a lot of people use Find My iPhone as a means to track one another, or as Jonathan mentioned, the air tags. I mean, again, like if this is something that's consensual, um, again, that information and the evidence that comes from it is legally acceptable, but it should always be done with mutual consent. You shouldn't be tracking
Yeah.
your spouse.
The
I
only
mean,
time I've really seen that be agreed to by the parties is if there's supervised visits with one
mhm,
parent. And those recordings can help the court figure out, how visits are going and have kind of an independent, neutral point of view on it.
sure.
But yeah, I mean, I would, I've never seen a case where a judge has said, yeah, you could go ahead and spy on your ex and, use
Yeah,
that
I
evidence in
mean,
court.
it all comes down to what's going to be looked upon in bad taste. And I mean, at the end of the day, surveillance
Mm,
in general is not something that's looked upon favorably. I mean, if you
no.
have, and going back to the initial premise, adultery is not going to impact your legal proceedings. So
Yeah.
going ahead with the surveillance in and of itself is not necessary. It really is not necessary. You know, Canada, Ontario is a no fault divorce. Process. It doesn't matter if one person cheated once, if they cheated 10 times, or they didn't cheat at all. There's the same legal process is going to unfold. So I would really advise not to even engage in any type of surveillance. It's just not necessary, and it can only harm you.
Yeah. No.
Um,
Excellent points.
and I know you spoke about the emotional impact, and you touched upon the breakdown of communication as a result of the adultery and the breakdown of trust. So when you have two parties come into your office, either that's through family mediation or you're doing collaborative practice. What are you speaking to them about? How are you overcoming these barriers? How are you overcoming this adversity as it relates to, coming to a point where we can actually have a discussion about trying to resolve the
Yeah. So the first thing to keep in mind is that discussions when you're very emotional about an issue rarely go well. Unless it's something you're super excited about, like going to see Green Day in concert live. Um, uh, you know, uh, Negative emotions don't lend themselves well to having difficult conversations because what happens is people's stress levels get elevated and then they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And when they're in that mode, they're probably in the fight mode and they're not thinking clearly, they're not thinking rationally, they're not able to problem solve. The parts of their brain that are involved in those tasks is shut off by the fight, flight, or freeze response. So if you're feeling very emotional about topic, then it's not the right time to talk about it. Obviously, talking about an affair will always be an emotional experience, but it's really important that the first step is, what I would call mental health first aid. When you find out about an affair, it's an emotional injury to you. It's an emotional injury to your relationship. And when people are first injured, they go into shock, and shock is not a good place to resolve complicated problems. So the first step should be reach out to a therapist. a close friend, a good family member, get the support that you need to be able to get through this. It's not easy dealing with this. It's very, very stressful, upsetting, and can cause a whole host of problems in your life. So, we're all social animals. We rely on each other for everything. Nothing that I ate today, I grew myself. I rely on farmers to grow it, people to truck it to the grocery store, and then the grocery stores to sell it to me. So I rely on other people all the time, every day. So does everybody else. And in a time of emotional turmoil, you need to rely on people even more, right? So first step, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Um, and you want to make sure that that help is not judgmental. Um, you know, um, Being judgmental in these situations doesn't really help. And You need someone who can give you some sound advice about whether to continue the relationship or whether to end it. And if you're going to continue it, what are the steps you need to take to resolve the issues that led to the affair, and then also the issues that came out of the affair, like the breach of trust, the communication problems, the emotional disconnection that you have in the relationship now. So I think therapy is the most important piece there. Whether you decide to stay together or separate, reach out to someone for support. Don't have discussions when you're super emotionally dysregulated, when you're really upset, really angry, really sad, really anxious. Do something to calm yourself down first before you have those conversations. Or maybe you need some time for that emotional injury to heal before you can get back into, peeling off that scab and kind of reopening the wound and dealing with it. But you want that wound to be mostly healed by the time you do that, or at least well on its way to being healed. Um, so and Listen to the advice of professionals. When this happens to people, they often feel lost, they don't know what to do, they're confused. And so go to a trusted professional and get their advice, and they'll be able to guide you on the right path. They won't make the decisions for you about whether to stay in the relationship or not, or how to proceed with the separation, all that kind of stuff, but they will help provide the support that you need to make that decision yourself. So those are kind of my tips. And then, in terms of communication between the spouse, if communication is going badly, don't talk at all, or only talk by text, or get a parenting app and communicate through that, or write letters to each other, or communicate through a third party. Whatever you can do to reduce conflict. Conflict is really bad for the parents themselves, but also for the kids. So anything you can do to reduce conflict in these situations will be really helpful. And then Do you want me to just go ahead and start talking about the impact on kids?
I think you covered it so well. I just had a question based on
Yeah.
your experience, whether you're a family mediator, or you're working as a family professional in the collaborative setting. How often do you see adultery or affairs as a barrier to at least breaking through the initial obstacle of getting to a point where the parties can actually have rational discussions about ways in which they can move forward, whether that's on parenting issues, on financial issues, whatever the mediation may be, or whatever it's comprising of. You know, how do you how often do you see the affairs and adultery as a barrier to breaking through that initial communication deadlock? Or
Yeah, it's
trust, because I know
very
culture of
common.
practice is all
Yeah.
about trust, right?
Yeah, it's about trust. And also, um, you know, sometimes when someone has been the victim of an affair, they're very angry, right? Like their response is more anger than sadness or anxious. And when they're angry, they want to hurt and punish the other person because they feel like they've been hurt. And hurting and punishing the other person just doesn't work in the collaborative process or in family mediation, because we're trying to come up with a parenting plan or calculate child support or spousal support, all those kinds of things. So I see that happening a lot. And when we're having negotiations about a separation agreement, whether it's spousal support or parenting schedule, you really want to be in your rational brain and really think things through, because this agreement that you're writing is going to be your agreement for the next, however many years. You want to make sure it's the right one and that you're negotiating in good faith. That means you're negotiating to get the best, separation agreement for both you and your ex, plus the best parenting schedule for the kids. But if you're going into the process for a different reason, like you want to hurt and punish your spouse for the affair, then the mediation or the collaborative work isn't going to be successful, because you're not negotiating in good faith. You're not negotiating on the topics that the mediator or the collaborative professionals can help you with. So if that's the case, maybe it's not the right time to have those negotiations, or maybe that person needs more support. Maybe they need a therapist who can, maybe meet with them either immediately before or immediately after your mediation or collaborative meetings. Maybe you need a divorce coach to help you, figure out how to manage your day-to-day response to the separation. Maybe you need like a support person who can help provide you with the emotional support you need, so that you are in your rational brain during your mediation or collaborative sessions. And part of that is on the parents to self-assess and say, like, am I ready for this process? And not everybody is. You may want to separate from your spouse as quickly as possible, but emotionally you may not be ready for that. And so maybe some work needs to be done before you can come back to the table. So that's a pretty common kind of scenario that I've worked with. And there's been a lot of couples where I've had to take one or the other aside and just say, hey, I think, maybe you need to do a bit more work on this or that before we can come back and finish this job, because you just don't seem like you're in a good place to have those negotiations right now.
No, I mean, fair enough. Like you said, you have to be level. I don't want to say level-headed, because I don't think that's a fair term, but you have to be able to think rationally. Like you said, these agreements are long term, and you want to make sure that you have
Yeah.
your full mental capacity engaged in your
And you're
and as well.
negotiating in good faith. That's really important, right? If you're not there to reach a good separation agreement and a good parenting agreement, then you're not ready.
I think it also ties into one's ability to be reasonable as well, right? Like I think if your
Yeah.
head's clouded with resentment and anger or you're hurt, it's very difficult to be reasonable. So all those points. Um, and I know we've touched on it a bit, but I definitely would love if you could please expand on it, is, the impact on the children. More often than not,
Yeah. So that,
there's when children are involved in affairs and adultery, it's bad enough that the parents are already separating, but now we're adding an additional factor.
yeah, absolutely. So the number one thing that I'll say to any parent who is experiencing an affair in their marriage, and you know, uh, don't involve the kids. No matter how you can justify involving the kids in your head, it's not going to be good for them. So keep them out of it. In fact, they don't even need to know that there was an affair. Remember that children, no matter how old, even teenagers, no child will truly understand or appreciate the reasons why adults engage in affairs, which are very complicated and multifaceted. Right? It's people see affairs as being very simple, like the person who had the affair is a bad person and that's why they had the affair, but that's not reality. Reality is that there are very complicated um, reasons why affairs happen. And it's usually a systemic issue in the family. It's not just one person acting badly. It's the way the family system works is not meeting their needs for whatever reason, or maybe there's a lot of conflict, or they're really unhappy, or whatever, and they step outside of the marriage. Um, so children will never really understand or appreciate the reasons why, and so they shouldn't be included in discussions about affairs. They don't need to know. It's not healthy for them, and I know it might be a controversial opinion for a lot of parents who want to tell their kids that their, ex is a big jerk and an affair, and that's why they're separating. But please do not involve the kids. It's really harmful for them to get involved. It causes them a lot of stress and can really impact their relationship with the other parent very negatively. And that is a very significant issue for them. The one exception I will say is if the children witnessed an affair, if they walked into a parent with another person, or they were the ones to discover the affair. In that case, you'll want to work with a family professional or a therapist to support the kids through the turmoil that the affair brings to the families and help coach the parents on how to address this issue. So, um, one thing I do want to say is kids at different ages will be impacted differently. Younger children, from the ages of 0 to, 6 or 7, I'll have no clue what an affair is or any understanding of this. But they are very vulnerable to stress. So if the affair is causing lots of fights between their parents and their parents are always going at it in front of them, that's going to be really bad. So we want to keep the fights away from the kids. We want to reduce their stress level. If they're going to go through a separation, that's already stressful enough. They don't need to add more stress to their plate by, being exposed to lots of conflict. And remember, conflict is very harmful for kids. It's one of what we call adverse childhood experiences, which are stressful events in a child's life that cause long-term permanent harm. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. So younger kids, they won't understand what's going on, but keep the stress away from them. Older kids are going to have more understanding, the older they are, of what's going on. But the risk with older kids, so kids from the ages of about 9 or 10 to teenagers, the risk is that they're going to take a side. If they find out that dad or mom had an affair, they're going to be aligning with the other parent, and that's really unhealthy for them. This is why, again, I'm going to emphasize, do not involve the kids in any of this. Even teenagers, even if they're 18, don't involve them. They don't need to be involved. It's very stressful for them. And if they pick a side, if they decide, well, I'm going to reject the parent who had an affair and I'm going to align with the parent who didn't have an affair, that rejection of that parent, that in itself is going to be harmful, even if they decide to reject that parent. We know that loss of a parent or parent-child contact problem or parent-child relationship problems are two things that very negatively impact kids during separation divorce. So we want to protect them from that. Don't involve the teenagers in the affair. If the affair comes out and they find out about it, then you need to find a therapist who can give you some advice on how to manage that. Someone who's got a lot of knowledge about parenting and can help give you and the other parent advice on how to manage the situation in the home. So yeah, ultimately the big takeaway is that stress is really bad for kids. Affairs cause a lot of stress in family systems. And so parents, it's your job to protect them from that stress and keep it away from them as much as possible. Deal with your adult issues among the adults. Don't involve the kids.
Hit the nail on the head, 100%. Um, and unfortunately, if it comes to the point where you've made a decision, or maybe you're even contemplating a decision of, X has occurred, what are my next steps? Um, Speaking to a lawyer, as Jonathan said, is extremely, extremely
Yeah.
important. I mean, you should definitely be reaching out to family professionals, whether that's a counselor, a therapist, a social worker, a trusted friend or family member. Those are all great things. But if you suspect that as a result of the affair or the adultery that's occurred, again, only suspect. It doesn't, you don't have to have a definitive outcome or a definitive idea of a next step, right? Regardless of if it's something that you're contemplating or maybe that the other spouse has brought forward as an idea, it's really important to seek the opinion and advice of a family lawyer. We can provide clarity on how adultery may affect the divorce process. I mean, ultimately, as we've discussed in this show today, it rarely does. But I mean, as a result of the adultery or the affair itself, um, the separation that comes from that actually has strong legal implications, again, as it relates to the division of property, navigating spousal support and child support issues, navigating parenting issues as a whole, right? So if you suspect that as a result of the adultery or the affair, that a separation is looming, or like I said, it doesn't mean that you have to separate. As Jonathan said, a lot of parents come to him, work out issues, and ultimately maybe they do reconcile. But if you suspect that a separation might be occurring, I would speak to a family lawyer as soon as possible. Um, in terms of further
So
legal support, I
I would
mean,
add to
sorry, go
that,
ahead.
Joe,
Yeah,
and just
please.
say that even if you don't want to separate, you probably should talk to a lawyer and just see what your options are, right? Because
100%.
you may make the decision, oh, I want to try to work on this, but it may not be successful in the future. And you just want to
Mhm.
know what your options are, right? What does separation look like? What are the legal implications? What are the financial implications? And you're not going to get that information unless you speak to a qualified lawyer.
100%, 100. And unfortunately, a family professional such as, a social worker or a therapist, they're not in that position to be able to give you that advice. So the only way you can
I
really
know.
get legal advice is through a family lawyer. And I mean, if we do end up getting to the point where the legal option does have to make itself prevalent and known in your family dynamic, going to court um, isn't always the definitive path. There's
No.
alternative forms of resolving disputes between families, separated parents, separating, common law partners, whether, married common law doesn't matter. There's so many different alternative dispute resolution, methods that can be engaged, whether that be mediation, arbitration, collaborative practice. There's so many ways, that, uh,
Yep.
family law issues
Family
can be resolved.
arbitration's another one.
Yeah, exactly. Family arbitration. There's so many alternative dispute resolution methods that can come about to help you resolve these issues. So that's sort of the legal support side. I mean, at the end of the day, like Jonathan said, whether you suspect separation might happen, even if you don't suspect it as being happen and you want to reconcile that relationship, it could be the idea that the other spouse maybe doesn't want to reconcile the relationship as a result of the action. So I mean, it's always good to get the opinion of a family law lawyer to see where you stand and the legal implications that can result or arise as a result of a separation. Jonathan, in
But
terms of,
you always want to
sorry, go ahead,
make
please.
decisions with the best information possible, right? If you don't have the information, you're probably not going to make a good decision. So, yeah.
Yeah, just foresight is super important, right? The ability to look ahead and see what may result or what may arise is
Yep.
really important. And so that's sort of the legal support. What are the options for mental health resources and mental health support? I know you've touched on it a bit, but maybe if you can expand further.
Yeah, so in every jurisdiction in Ontario, if everyone on our call here is joining us from Ontario, there are free mental health resources in every region. So there will be a mental health service for adults in my area in Durham region. It's Durham Family Services is one option. Catholic Durham Family Services is another option. Those are government subsidized programs that won't cost you if you don't have enough income to pay. And then there's also free mental health resources for children, usually a children's mental health organization in your area. In our area, it's either Kinark for kids under the age of 12, or it's Frontenac Youth Services for kids over the age of 12. It might be a bit different in every jurisdiction. Um, so, for example, in Peterborough, it's Kinark and Peterborough Youth Services. In Coburg, it's Kinark and Rebound Youth Services. So it's a little bit different in every region, but go check online. If your job includes a family counseling program, usually they're called EAPs or EFAPs, stands for Employee Assistance Program or Employee Family Assistance Programs. That will usually give you quick access to therapy, usually within a few days. So find out what that number is from your workplace and connect with those people. Most people who work also have extended health benefits that will cover the cost of things like massage therapy, chiropractic, physiotherapy, that will also cover psychotherapy. So check in with that. That might uh, allow you to pay for more sessions without costing you anything. And then ultimately, if you have the funds and you don't belong to a EAP program, then you can just reach out to a therapist for support. The best places to look for people would be Psychology Today is a good one. They have a searchable thing where you can, search for the issues and the gender and the location that you want. Another good option would be this a social work association has a find a social worker program. I'm pretty sure the psychotherapy association also has a similar thing, and or the psychological association of Ontario. So there's lots of resources out there for people. There's online therapy programs like Inkblot and BetterHelp. So there's a ton. I think after COVID, psychotherapy has just exploded, and there's so many options these days.
For sure, I can believe it. Um, after everything we've discussed today, do you have any final thoughts? Maybe you want to expand on anything we discussed, or just any recommendations in general?
Yeah, I think just my last piece of advice for people is, recognize that this is a really tough situation to deal with, and it's going to take time to heal from it. And don't hesitate to reach out to sport for support. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention about the mental health resources is there are groups out there for people who've suffered through adultery. So you can go, sometimes churches offer it, sometimes counseling agencies offer them. There's online groups, so there are peer support groups where you can just hang out with a bunch of other people in similar circumstance to you. So there are lots of supports out there.
Amazing. Thanks, Jonathan. And with
Awesome.
that, thank you all for tuning into Family Law Now. Listening to Jonathan is always so great. He's so knowledgeable, and I always love co-hosting this session with him. It's really always eye-opening for me, and even from you, I learned so much new information. So I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And for
Always
everyone
a pleasure,
else
Joe.
at home watching, thank you, Jonathan. And for everyone watching either via Zoom or YouTube, if you are watching via Zoom following the session, there will be a brief survey, and that will appear on your screen, and that will allow you to share your comments and suggestions for future topics that you'd like us to explore. And as always, your feedback is greatly appreciated. On that note, if you have made it to the end of the show, you know that we always offer a unique code with respects to taking advantage of an opportunity for a complimentary consultation with one of our lawyers at our firm, Russell Alexander Family Lawyers. In order to do so, please contact our intake team at intake@russellalexander.com and provide the code March Break. Jonathan got me thinking about it when he told me March Break's coming in a couple weeks. So that's the code for today, March Break. And you're going to use that code to schedule your appointment. If you do want to schedule an appointment, that has to be done before Friday at noon of this week. Your consultation does not need to be before Friday at noon this week, but you do have to schedule your appointment by that date. Registration is also now open for our next event, What the Judicial System Values in Parents, another great session. All you have to do is just go to our website at russellalexander.com/familylawnow, and you'll be able to register for our next event. As always, thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your insight today. And to the viewers, thank you for tuning into Family Law Now After Hours. And with that, we are officially after hours.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Joe. Take
Jonathan.
care.